Hello and welcome to this online PowerPoint lecture. The advantage of this kind of lecture, rather than doing it live in class, is that you can actually stop it, go back, have me repeat or whatever as many times as you like without any embarrassment if you're an introvert or anything like that. So, but in order for this to work, dear students, you need to write down questions from this lecture and bring them to class. And I will ask you if you have questions. If there were things in here that were not clear, I would love to clarify them. Okay, so this only works if you engage. I'm going to start from the very beginning with a short bio of Ferdinand de Saussure. He was born in Geneva, Switzerland. By the age of 15, he knew 5 languages. He published his first book at the age of 21 on the vowel A in Indo-European languages. That's the letter A for us English speakers. He earned his doctorate at the age of 23, which makes me very jealous and feel very inadequate because I earned my doctorate around 30. He taught in Paris with great distinction. He never published anything else. Actually, I think I was closer to 35. Anyway, his most influential work, the thing that everybody knows him for, is his course in general linguistics, which 3 of his students reconstructed and published as a book after comparing their lecture notes. The ideas he taught proved incredibly influential, but they weren't really to find widespread acceptance for another 50 years after he gave the lectures and decades after his death. So, what is his linguistic theory about anyway? Semiotics, Saussure's linguistics, his linguistic theory, which is known as semiotics from the Latin semen, which is sign or seed. But in this case, semiotics is the fountainhead for French structuralism and post-structuralism. Everything that comes after, at least if you're taking popular culture and media theory, a lot that comes after is strongly influenced, if not inspired, by Saussure's theory. And his semiotics is based on at least 3 propositions. Number 1, the dual nature of the sign, the 2-part nature of the sign. Number 2, the arbitrary nature of the connection of those 2 parts. And 3rd, the dual nature of language. What do we mean by each of those? All right, the dual nature of the sign, the 2-part nature of the sign. The sign, which in Saussure's theory is the basic carrier of meaning, roughly equivalent to what we consider the word, but he says that's too imprecise. He wants to call it the sign. It's broken by Saussure into 2 parts, the signifier and the signified. The signifier is an acoustical image. That is the image or the sound you make when you actually say it, arbor, which is Latin for tree, and and the sound that you hear in your head when you read the word arbor. Okay? And the signified is the concept that is tied to this acoustical image, this sound image. All right? So signifiant, or the signifier, is this acoustical image. The signified is the concept. And here's the important part. Both parts of the sign, both signifier and signified, are defined by opposition to other elements within the whole language system. And so the way I put it, it is what it is because it's not what it's not. It is defined by the difference it has from other signifiers or signifieds that surround it. He says this in his course in general linguistics. Everything we have said so far comes down to this. In the language, la langue, but we'll get to that later. In the language system itself, there are only differences. Even more important than that is the fact that, although in general a difference presupposes positive terms between which the difference holds, in language there are only differences and no positive no positive terms. That is, there are no fixed values within the sign system. Everything is defined only by difference. Whether we take the signification, that is the signified, the concept, or the signal, the signifier, the acoustical image, the language includes neither ideas nor sounds existing prior to the linguistic system, but only conceptual and phonetic differences arising out of that system. In a sign, what matters more than any idea or sound associated with it positively is the other signs that surround it and differ with it negatively. So the mental picture I want you to get is of a grid filled with signifiers, and the signifier for arbor or tree in English is a position within that grid that is, and you can only locate it through difference to other signifiers. And the same thing with the concept of the tree, the signified. That is, both parts of the sign are defined by opposition to other elements within the whole language system, right? So the word dog is what it is because it's not what it's not. Cog, jog, log, dot, bog, dig, whatever, right? And the signified, the concept we have of dog, is what it is because it's not cat or tree or fire hydrant or person or bird or mouse. It is what it is only because it's not what it's not. All right, so that's the first one, the dual nature of the sign. Signifier and signified both defined by differences. All right, second proposition, the connection between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. It is joined together by nothing but cultural convention and not by some natural bond. So, as an illustration, I would say to people of different languages, what is this silhouette of this thing here? And English speakers would say dog, and Chinese speakers would say gao, and French speakers would say le chien, and Czech speakers would say pes, and German speakers would go Hund, and we would all say, ah, no, you're wrong, because this is the natural word for dog, and somebody else would come in and say, hold on, you guys. There is no natural signifier for this thing. It is only defined by cultural convention. It's only, like for English speakers, it is dog. For Czech speakers, it is pes. For French speakers, it is chien. Right? There's no need to argue about that. In other words, the connection between the signifier and the concept is purely culturally defined by cultural convention. So, and here's the wider point, for structuralism, meaning the way a specific language divides up and categorizes things in the world is a function of arbitrary, and arbitrary means not natural, conventional, culturally determined oppositions within the language system, within la langue. That is to say, for Saussure, language means not referentially by referring naturally to a thing out in the world, but differentially through differences within the sign system. And those differences between signifiers and signifies are culturally determined. Okay, third proposition. Yes, not like that, but through differences. Okay, that's how languages do, according to Saussure. All right, the third proposition, the dual nature of language. La langue is necessary for la parole. The structure of the system, the structure of the language system, la langue, or what sometimes gets called language, in some translations of Saussure. La langue provides the necessary, but I would argue not sufficient, condition to generate actual utterances, la parole. So in this cartoon from Donald Palmer, Does the Center Hold? All of this system that is passively assumed by language speakers is necessary for you to say anything. And what structuralism, what Saussure's semiotics focuses on then, is privileging system over process. So for Saussure, linguistic analysis should privilege the synchronic structural perspective over the diachronic historical perspective. What does that mean? Synchronic is a compound word made by the Greek prefix sun, which is one, chronos, which is time. You look at it at a single time. You freeze the system in time and say, I want to study the relationships between all the signifiers and signifieds at this time t1. Okay? Diachronic is Greek prefix dia, through chronos, through time. And that is, you want to look at the development of a language system over time. And Saussure says, no, you can't do that. Like, historical language analysis are fun, but you can't be real scientific about it. The structure, the system of the rules that govern what people say at a specific time is more important than la parole, the things people actually say, which do change over time. And the little cartoon thing that I found on this graphic. Though I made great contributions to the historical study of language, the diachronic study of language, I argued that the history of words and grammatical structures did little to define what language truly is. I believe it more fruitful to compare a modern language against itself synchronically, whereas my precursors and contemporaries were comparing a modern language against its past self. And I also had a wonderful mustache, and he does. Now, a structuralist approach to culture takes these insights and applies them to cultural entities, symbols, and advertisements and such. And Saussure called this semiology. It is now referred to more commonly as cultural semiotics. And here's someone is doing the signified thing with the McDonald's "I'm loving it" commercial sign. So you've got the signified, which is the McDonald's corporation, the McDonald's restaurants. "I'm loving it" is the signifier. Wait, I think this is upside down. I did not make this, by the way. Okay, the signifier, things that give meaning, word, image. So the acoustical image, the slogan, the rather empty slogan in a McDonald's advertisement from a while ago was "I'm loving it," and then that was supposed to bring to mind the concept of the McDonald's restaurant that you would love, and you combine them together and you have a meaningful advertisement for McDonald's, the sign. All right, let's look at the 5 questions for Saussure. And for those of you in popular culture and media theory, you understand these questions, you know these questions. These are things that, these are questions that we go over for every language theory. What is popular culture and media according to a Saussurean perspective? What is it actually about when all is said and done at a kind of depth level? Third, what about cultural agents? How much agency? How is the agent defined, and how much agency do they actually have, and what motivates them? Fourth, how do cultures change? How does this theory account for cultural change? And fifth, how do we analyze according to this theory? So the first question, and let me say again, for you guys in pop culture and media theory, do not do Saussure. He didn't actually articulate a cultural theory. This is my reading of the implications of a Saussurean theory for culture, but you may not do your paper on Saussure, okay? So these are educated guesses about how to apply Saussure to cultural systems and cultural signs and cultural texts. So what would popular culture or media be according to a Saussurean perspective? Well, culture would be treated as a sign system, of course, like la langue, a grammar, a system of communication, a set of rules and signs and symbols defined by their opposition to other signs. And that is a very common way of seeing culture today. So, for example, let me take a really simple example. The blink versus the wink. On the left, you see Michael Cera blinking. You probably didn't even notice it the first time you saw it, right? Because it's an involuntary, insignificant thing that people just do, all right? But in the right-hand picture, we see Michael Cera, I think from Scott Pilgrim, winking. And that codes as significant because it's not something people necessarily do unless they have an eye infection or something like that, right? So if I looked at one of my students and I gave you a wink, everyone in the class would say, oh, they have some unspoken understanding or secret or something going on, maybe a joke or something. And I do not randomly wink at students, right? I typically don't wink at students at all, but I do when the illustration needs to happen. Or if I blink really, really hard, that could code as frustration, all right? So but notice the blink and the wink are defined by the difference to one another, right? The blink is different from the wink, and the wink is different from the blink. Let me give you another example, a little bit more complicated now. The traffic light. It is a simple cultural system. You've got a traffic light. Each light's color, the signifier, is defined by opposition to the others. Red means not green. Green means not red. And both of them, yellow or amber, means neither red nor green. It's an opposition thing. And the signifieds, that is, the concepts we're supposed to get when we see a red light or a green light or an amber light, is also defined by opposition. If you see red, the concept you're supposed to have is stop, which means don't go. In green, it's go, don't stop. And yellow, it's get ready, in opposition to both going and stopping. Get ready for either one of these that's going to follow. All right, so if you got that, okay, how it could be applied to culture, then let's complexify it just a bit. This is Russian structural linguistic Roman Jakobson. He got his PhD right here in Prague at Charles University. He taught here until the Nazis came, and Russians at that time were not so popular with German fascists. And he improved on Saussure, or added a level of complexity, by asserting that language works as a process of paradigmatic selection and syntagmatic combination. I'm not expecting you to be familiar with these terms. What do we mean by paradigmatic selection and syntagmatic combination? So let's just take the unit of a sentence. Okay, he worked with larger units than just the sign. Let's take the sign, let's take the sentence at the top. The ridiculous girl fell into the pond. Okay? Now, the way Jakobson was looking at it is each of these terms, each of these words or signs in the sentence is itself a a paradigm, okay, that could be substituted with another paradigm that would be similar, different. All right, so what you do when you're formulating a sentence is you select different paradigms to sort of activate. Okay, so you, instead of the ridiculous girl, you could have said the silly person jumped into the river, or the foolish woman tripped into the lake, or the silly princess walked into the pool, right? You just mix and match. You have to make these selections. That's one operation when you're making a sentence. And then the second operation is syntagmatic combination. You have to take all of those paradigms that you have chosen, that you've selected, and string them together into a whole meaning unit. The ridiculous girl fell into the pond, right? So in the bottom illustration, the cat or elephant or typewriter or asteroid, scratch, smash, like you choose those. And different paradigms. Okay, so I like to give you guys mental images. When I think of this paradigmatic selection, and I know this sounds weird, but I think of a gymnasium floor, like an exercise floor, with strings of Christmas lights coming from foot switches on the floor. And part of making a sentence is choosing which foot switch to step on, which activates one string or a different string of Christmas lights. And then you step to the side of the lights, and that's syntagmatic combination. You see all the lights together in a row. I don't know if that's helpful. Maybe my brain's just weird. But please note, different paradigms introduce different shades of meaning. Each sign carries with it, each paradigm carries with it a chain of connotations, that is, that string of Christmas tree lights, that are defined through binary opposition against other chains of connotations. So, in this case, a news report could say, soldiers today attacked a village, or freedom fighters today attacked a village, or guerrillas, or terrorists, or volunteers, or gunmen, right? Think about how the words chosen in the news, or from government statements, or economic reports, or whatever, light up different chains of connotations, right? Think about Putin saying, we carried out a special military operation, rather than using the word war. Special military operation. Or think about somebody talking about racial justice versus somebody talking about DEI favoritism or reverse racism, right? These are, government waste versus necessary service when you're talking about a statement from Doge. Now, how do we apply this not just to sentences, but to cultural symbols? This is taken from a very famous study or analysis by the cultural theorist John Fiske, cultural analyst, who wrote a book called Understanding Popular Culture. And he wrote a whole essay on the string of connotations associated with different types of blue jeans. Okay, so you have your generic jeans, which would be like your Levi's or Wrangler or whatever, and then you have designer jeans, which would be like Jordache, and I don't even know the names of the special, yeah, I really don't know designer jeans. I don't ever buy them, so I don't know them. But you guys do, all right? So have a designer jean manufacturer in your mind. And so he said each of these activates different chains of connotation. Generic genes are classless. They don't differentiate between rich and poor. Rich people wear them, poor people wear them, whatever. Designer genes are upscale, upper class. They denote wealth. Generic genes are associated with the country. Designer genes are associated with urban life. Generic genes are sort of communal, like you're in every guy, you're in every person. Designer genes are, no, I'm making a fashion statement, I'm socially distinctive. Generic genes are unisex. I mean, now they're called dad genes, but both dads and moms can wear them. Designer genes are feminine, rarely masculine, but they can be. And this was written late 80s, so bear that in mind. I would also say that generic genes are kind of ageless, right? Or associated with middle-aged people, whereas designer genes are more associated with youth because they're thin enough to get into them. Generic genes are work. You wear them for yard work and stuff like that. Designer genes are for leisure. They're for going to the club. Generic genes are traditional, associated with the Old West and cowboys and stuff like that. Designer genes are more contemporary, associated with the current fashion scene. Generic genes are unchanging, right? Levi's, for the most part, their just basic gene is the same as it was in the 19th century. But designer genes are constantly changing according to the fashions of the times. They're transient. And he says, finally, generic genes are associated with the West, with the Old West, cowboys and stuff. Generic genes are associated with the more urban East. And I would say make an exception for LA as well. But behind the West and the East stands, at least in the American psyche, nature, parks and Yosemite and plains versus culture, New York City, right? And fashion capitals and stuff like that. Just from which kind of gene you decide to wear, you culturally enact a different set of paradigms, paradigmatic selection. Now, what about syntagmatic combination? Well, syntagmatic combination has to do with stringing elements together. And here, Vladimir Propp, a Russian folklorist, did a study of hundreds of Russian folk tales, and he broke them down into their variant constituent parts. Not any folk tale would have all of these, but a lot of them, like, they come in a certain order, and you choose some and you string them together. So his narrative functions, I'm not going to go over all of them. I'll let you guys, pause the video if you want to. But just know that these are different ways that a tale unfolds. From the hero gets called all the way to the wedding and the village celebrates and he marries the princess or whatever. And these things get strung together to have a different folktale. Now, how could you analyze a simple piece of culture using both of these, paradigmatic selection and syntagmatic combination? Well, let me imagine a soap dish, a washing up liquid soap commercial. And it begins, let me just tell you about my imagined dish soap commercial. It begins with a woman coming into the kitchen and looking at a pile of dirty dishes and say, "Oh, look at this pile of dirty dishes. My evening is ruined." And then a voice from off camera, a comforting male voice, says, "Don't worry, ma'am, just use Wizzo." And then while she's cleaning with all these suds and stuff like that, it says, "Wizzo uses a special formula of soap in order to make your job easier." and then dissolve or wipe to a bunch of clean dishes on a drying rack so that your job is easier and you're free to enjoy your evening. And she looks at the camera and says, "Thank you, Wizzo. You saved my evening." End of commercial. Okay? Like a 15-second spot, something like that. All right, so what are the paradigms that were chosen within this commercial? And I'm trying to be typical. I'm trying to be a little, just a little silly. What are the paradigms that are chosen? First of all, it's a woman. Why isn't there a man saying, "My evening is ruined. Look at all these dirty dishes"? Why? Because most of their target audience sees women as the ones who do the dishes, right? That's just cultural convention. Why not the kids? Maybe she doesn't have kids. It's a younger woman. Why not an older woman? Because they want to appeal at youthful and stuff like that. So you see these paradigms. Why the kitchen? The color of the kitchen matters. If it's white, that means something. If it's black, that would be weird. No, it should be white or yellow, something bright, something cheerful, so they associate with the product. But each of these things is defined by a binary opposition to whatever else it's not. It is what it is, because it's not what it's not. This woman is a woman because it's not a man, because men would be weird. That would be a weird connotation. But we choose the paradigm of woman. We choose the paradigm of a brightly colored kitchen, stuff like that. What about the voice? What about the voice off screen? Why is it a male voice? Because people associate that with authority, comfort, whatever. A woman's voice would be maybe odd. You could do it, but it would have a different connotation. Why not a child's voice? Because a child's voice would be just weird. So you have this choice of paradigms, okay, that make the commercial what it is. It is what it is because they've chosen things in opposition to other things, that because they want to ignite one chain of connotations and not another chain of connotations. They want to activate one set of meanings, not another set of meanings. And then once you've chosen all of your elements, you've selected all your paradigms, then you string them together. And what we have here, the typical fairy tale we have here, or the tale that we have strung together, is we have a tale of redemption. What do I mean by that? Well, you have a beginning. Oh, my evening is ruined. You have a middle. Don't worry. And an intervention by a power who can save, or that can save. Don't worry, ma'am. Use Wizzo. Wizzo's got a special formula for extra suds, yada, yada, yada. And then you've got a conclusion. Thank you, Wizzo. My evening is saved. And that is your basic redemption story. Trouble, intervention from a higher power or some magical thing, in this case, Wizzo, dish soap, and then the conclusion, the happy ending. Okay, so all of that is, what is popular culture from a linguistic perspective? Now, second question of the 5 questions. What is popular culture or media ultimately about? And cultural theorist who writes about this stuff, and Introduction to Popular Culture and Cultural Theory, super helpful for you guys in pop culture media theory. I used it a lot when I was first coming up with this class. A very good secondary source, I should add. Story says, it is structure which makes meaning possible. The task of structuralism, therefore, is to make explicit the rules and conventions, that is, the structure, which govern the production of meaning, la parole. So, structuralism sees popular culture and media as being ultimately about convention, structure, arbitrary patterns that are imposed upon experience by which we communicate with each other. So, popular culture and media, then, are not about meaning in any sort of deep human sense of the word, meaningfulness, human significance. It's about codes. It's ways of manipulating structure or being manipulated by the structure in the sending of these messages. So the question remains, is there any meaning beyond or under these codes or conventions, or is it all kind of surface level? And that depends on what kind of structuralist you're studying. Mostly, structuralists working in cultural studies have a socialist political orientation of one sort or another. They assume that the real meaning of the codes lies in the way that they further bourgeois ideology. The Wizzo soap is saying you can find salvation in a thing you buy, for example. Others, postmodern structuralists, postmodern semioticians, assume that the language system covers over the ultimate meaninglessness of existence, that there is no deeper meaning, period. If there is any meaning that cannot be caught in cultural or linguistic codes, something that transcends cultural codes, that transcends linguistic codes, it is for them quite literally meaningless. It cannot be spoken and expressed linguistically, and therefore it simply doesn't exist. Many of these postmodern semioticians believe that Saussure's assertion about the arbitrariness of the signifier's connection with the signified indicates an arbitrariness about meaning in general, that meaning is ultimately relative. There is no natural or ultimate meanings to anything. The arbitrariness of the signifier-signified relationship is an indicator of the arbitrariness of reality. That is, the philosophical implications of Saussure's structuralism for them is nihilism. There is no inherent meaning to anything. But please notice this is an assumption, not a convincing argument. Just because there are no natural signs, save perhaps onomatopoeic words like achoo and kaboom and meow and woof woof and things like that, just because there are no natural linkages between signifiers and signifieds does not mean that there are no meanings that transcend cultural code systems. Saussure himself never drew such a conclusion. A philosophical conclusion. That assumption only holds if it can be shown that human language is the origin of all meaning in the world. That is, that we humans make our own meaning against a background of ultimate chaos and meaninglessness. And even though that is a very fashionable assumption these days, it is also a very debatable one. Why? Well, it's debatable because we simply don't live our lives as if that were true. We assume every day that there are truths and meanings out there that exist before we express them in language and culture, meanings that literally transcend culture. For example, evil. The evil of genocide, the evil of abusing child, or honor killings. Or another example, human love. It's out there. It's not ultimately meaningless. Though these things, love and evil, are culturally expressed, they are expressed in cultural forms, and those forms are different in different cultures. They seem to have roots that run far deeper than simply our cultural codes. They have deep human roots, for lack of a better word. So I am quite skeptical of the way that structuralism has been used to promote relativistic, nihilistic worldviews, and we will see a lot more of this when we get into post-structuralism, by the way. All right, question 3. What about actors and motivation? If structuralism is to be consistent, then motivation is a non-issue. Actors, from a synchronic perspective, are determined by the structure of the system. From the perspective of la langue, of the synchronic study of the language system. Speech, or la parole, is the place where individual motivations come into play. But since semiotics privileges the system over the actual utterances, over the actual speech, because that's what can be studied more precisely and scientifically, motivations are simply not explored. From the perspective of structuralism, we are trapped inside a sign system we cannot change. And post-structuralists like Derrida and so forth push that perspective even further, saying that we don't speak the system as much as the system speaks us. All right, question 4. How does semiotics apply to cultural studies? When applied to cultural studies, how does semiotics account for change in culture? And the short answer is very badly. While Saussure mentions both the immutability and the mutability of the sign and seems to take into account the changes in the sign system, structuralism still privileges the synchronic, timeless system over the diachronic historical process that changes the system. This has been a major criticism of structuralism, that it doesn't adequately account for cultural change. But note that when he talks about the mutability of the sign, Saussure does suggest that this relationship between signifier and signified is somewhat a slippery one because it's only based in convention, because it's arbitrary, and therefore it can change over time. And this is what post-structuralism, especially Derrida, concentrates on, the slippage between signifier and signified, until all you are left with is play between arbitrary signifiers slipping around without ever coming to rest in a signified. The concepts are just reduced to acoustical images that kind of bump into each other. You'll see what I mean when we get to Derrida. We'll get to Derrida after Roland Barthes. And question 5, how should one analyze popular culture or a media text according to a Saussurean perspective? Saussure maps out this territory in advance, calling it semiology, now more commonly called cultural semiotics. In other words, popular culture and media texts and collections of texts are to be treated as sign systems, the individual signs gaining meaning through binary opposition with other signs in the system. And then you can move further using Jacobson's categories to give a paradigmatic, synchronic, paradigmatic selection, and syntagmatic, that is joining all of the pieces together diachronically throughout the text. You can give syntagmatic and paradigmatic and syntagmatic readings of the piece you're working with in order to kind of do both axes to see the structure of the advertisement or whatever. But again, remember, no Saussure, no Romanowski in your papers. But we will see more of this when we move on to Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss's structuralism that Will Wright draws upon in his analysis of the Western. Okay, that's it. We are done. Thank you for listening, and please note you will need to do this. You'll need to have some mastery over these terms for quizzes coming up and things like that. I will feel myself enabled to draw from any of these terms. Okay, so if you have questions about these terms, bring them to class. And otherwise, have a great rest of your day and rest of your week, and I will see you in class. Bye-bye.